Lightning Reborn, Part 1. The White Meadow. The lightning found Maren Solís on a Tuesday, which she had always considered the most unremarkable day of the week. A day that existed, it seemed. Poorly to remind you that Monday was over, but Friday remained a distant, unearned country. It was the kind of day you forgot almost as soon as it happened. She would spend the rest of her life thinking about the irony of that. She had been crossing the open meadow behind her mother's house in the Blue Ridge foothills, a quarter-mile of tall grass and clover that her mother refused to have mowed because she liked the way it moved in the wind, liked the way the fireflies used it in July like a ballroom. Maren had walked that meadow 10,000 times. She knew every soft depression in the earth, every rusted fence post standing at the tree line like a forgotten soldier, every spot where the ground went slightly damp near the creek and your shoe came back muddy if you weren't careful. She knew it the way you only know a place you've walked since childhood. Not consciously, but in the body, in the bones. The sky that afternoon had been doing something theatrical. She had noticed it from her mother's kitchen window while rinsing her coffee mug. The clouds in the west going green at their edges, the particular sickly green that didn't mean rain so much as it meant consequence. Her mother had been napping. Maren had glanced at the window and thought, vaguely, that she should wait. Then her phone buzzed with a text from her husband Daniel asking what time she'd be home, and she typed back leaving now without really thinking. And she walked out the back door and into the meadow with her bag over one shoulder and her keys already in her hand. She made it perhaps 2/3 of the way across. Later, much later, when she'd read everything she could find about lightning strike survivors, she would learn that many of them described the same impossible thing. Not a sound, not a sensation of heat or impact, but a sudden and complete whiteness. As if the entire visible world had been replaced in an instant with blank paper. As if someone had simply deleted the contents of everything and left only the page. That was what happened to Maren. One moment she was walking through tall grass with her keys in her hand and Daniel's text half read on her phone screen. And then there was white that was not a color, but a presence. Absolute and enormous. And then there was nothing at all. What happened to her body in those seconds was more violent than the absence she experienced. The bolt hit the ground 3 feet to her left, and the current moved through the earth and up through her feet and through her entire nervous system in a fraction of a second. It stopped her heart. It threw her 12 feet through the air. It burned the soles off her shoes and fused the zipper of her bag into a single solid scene, and melted the screen of her phone into a warped black rectangle. It did something else too, something slower and stranger, something that worked its way across the surface of her back, like a river finding its path. But she wouldn't understand that part for 3 days. Her mother found her 17 minutes later, lying face down in the flattened grass, and the scream she let out carried all the way to the tree line. Maren woke on the 3rd day. It happened in the early morning, around 4, when the hospital floor was at its quietest, and the light in the hallway had that particular flat blueness of institutional night. She didn't come back to consciousness dramatically. No gasping, no confusion, no cinematic opening of eyes. She simply became aware. Gradually, the way you become aware of being awake after a dreamless sleep. The ceiling tiles above her, the cool weight of a blanket. A sound like distant machinery, which turned out to be Daniel sleeping in the chair beside her bed, with his mouth open, his hands still wrapped around hers even in sleep, as if his body had refused to let go even when his mind finally surrendered to exhaustion. She lay there for a long time without moving, taking inventory. She was alive. This seemed, in those first quiet minutes, both completely ordinary and absolutely astonishing. 2 things she would spend years trying to reconcile. Her left side felt strange, distant, like a radio station coming in through static. Her throat was dry in a way that went beyond thirst, more like something had been extracted from it. Her back ached with a deep, structural persistence, the way her whole skeleton aches after a fever, as though the bones themselves had been tested, She turned her head and looked at Daniel sleeping. His face, in the blue light, was exhausted in a way she'd never seen before. Not tired, but depleted, as if worry had been burning through him steadily for days and had used up something essential. There was a coffee cup on the floor beside his chair. There were 4 more behind it. She thought, I am alive, and he is here, and that should be enough. And it was. For a little while, it was. The burns revealed themselves in stages, the way all significant things do. The nursing staff had been monitoring the surface wounds, the entry and exit points, the places where the current had concentrated, but it was a young resident named Dr. Okafor who first noticed the extent of what covered her back. He was soft-spoken and precise, with reading glasses he pushed to the top of his head when he wasn't using them. And he had the particular bedside manner of someone who had trained himself to deliver extraordinary information in an ordinary voice. He asked one morning if he could examine her back. A nurse helped her sit forward. Her gown was lowered. The room became very still. Maren could feel the silence before she could see the cause of it. She'd become sensitive to the quality of people's silences in those days. The polite silence, the professional silence, the silence of someone trying very hard not to react. This silence was none of those. This silence was the silence of people in the presence of something they didn't have a category for. Mrs. Solís, Dr. Okafor said, in his careful, steady voice, I'd like to show you something, if you're ready. A nurse brought a mirror. It was the long rectangular kind, mounted on wheels, and she positioned it before Maren and then angled a second mirror behind so that Maren could see her own back reflected back at her. She looked. At first, what she registered was the Lichtenberg figure, the lightning signature, the fractal bloom of red and silver lines that spread across the skin the way frost spreads across a window pane, the way roots spread beneath soil, the way rivers spread across a delta seen from above. She had read about these in the hospital, in her hours of sleepless research. They were well documented. They were expected. She had even, in some strange way, been comforting herself with the idea that what she would see would be strange but explicable, the beautiful, predictable mathematics of electricity finding its path. But this was something else. The lines were not random. They were not simply fractal. They had intention, or appeared to, which amounted to the same thing. There were lines that ran parallel to each other in a way that suggested roads. There was a thick, sinuous line that curved and branched in a way that was unmistakably a river system. Along one edge of her left shoulder blade, the branching thinned and curved into a shape that her cartographer's eye recognized immediately, viscerally, with a certainty that arrived before she'd even consciously processed the image, a coastline. Ragged and specific and real, not the smooth abstraction of a child's drawing, but the genuine, idiosyncratic edge of land against water, full of coves and points and the kind of irregularity that only nature and time produce. And in the lower right, near the small of her back, a cluster of converging lines, close and purposeful, that looked like a harbor. Maren stared at it for a long time. Nobody spoke. It's a map, she said. Her voice sounded far away to her, like someone speaking from the next room. Nobody in that room, not Dr. Okafor, not the nurse, not Daniel, who had come to stand behind her without her noticing, argued with her, because there was nothing to argue. It was, plainly and impossibly, a map. She reached back with 2 fingers and pressed them gently against the harbor in the small of her back. The skin there was still tender, still healing, but beneath the tenderness, beneath the burn, she felt something she would never be able to adequately describe to anyone. A sensation that was not physical exactly, but was located in the body. A recognition. The way you feel when you hear a piece of music from your childhood that you had completely forgotten, and your whole body knows it before your mind catches up. She had been here before. Part 2, the dreaming. She did not tell Daniel about the feeling. She wasn't sure she had the words for it, and she loved him too much to hand him something she couldn't yet hold herself. But she began to dream. The dream started in the hospital, and continued after she came home, and they were unlike any dream she'd had before. Most of her dreams, the ones she could remember, had the quality of collage. Her childhood home rearranged into impossible architecture, faces belonging to the wrong people, narratives that dissolved the moment she tried to hold them. The new dreams were different. They were precise. They were consistent. Night after night, she found herself in the same place. A small, wooden room, low-ceilinged, smelling of pine resin and salt. There was a writing table against the wall, and on the writing table there was always a map, spread flat and held at its corners by smooth river stones. And she, the Maren in the dream, the woman in the dream, was always bent over this table, with a fine-tipped pen, drawing. She drew roads and paths, rocky shores and coves. She drew the contour lines of hills with the patient authority of someone who has walked every one of them. She drew the harbor, its bent foam shape, its particular shelter from the eastern wind. She drew the old cemetery on the island's north end, and the 2 freshwater springs, and the path through the birch grove that turned to mud after rain and needed to be taken carefully. She drew with love. That was the clearest thing, the thing that hit Maren hardest when she woke from these dreams and lay in the dark beside Daniel, heart loud in her chest. Whoever was drawing that map loved the place. She was drawing the way you can only love a place that formed you, that held you, that witnessed your entire life and absorbed your history into its soil. She was drawing it the way you might draw the face of someone you were afraid of forgetting. And every morning Maren woke with her back aching in the specific places the map burned into it, as though the dream had been pressing new ink. She began to keep a notebook on the nightstand. She drew what she remembered, the layout of paths, the shape of coves, the placement of the springs. After 3 weeks, she had covered 40 pages. She looked at those pages every morning like a woman trying to remember a word in a language she thought she'd lost. She told Daniel she was working. She was. Daniel was patient and gentle, and frightened in a way he was trying hard to conceal. He brought her tea she didn't ask for and made dinner every night and called her workplace twice a week to tell them she wasn't ready yet, even on the weeks when she thought she might be. He was not a man who talked about his feelings with any fluency, but he expressed them constantly through action, through the tea, through the dinners, through the way he always made sure to be in whatever room she was in without making it seem like surveillance. One night she caught him standing in the doorway of her study, looking at the notebook pages she pinned to the wall. He didn't know she was behind him. He stood there for a long time, studying the drawings, and his face and profile was open in a way it rarely was, unguarded and afraid. She put her hand on his back. He turned and looked at her, and she could see him composing himself, assembling the pieces of the practical, steady man he was trying to be for her. "You're gonna go find it," he said. Not a question. "I think I have to." He looked at the drawings again. Then he looked at her with the eyes of a man who had sat beside her hospital bed for 3 days, waiting to find out whether she would come back to him, and who had decided somewhere in those 3 days that whatever version of her returned, he would choose it. "Then I'll hold things together here," he said, "while you do." She pressed her forehead against his shoulder. "I know where it is," she said into the fabric of his shirt. "I think I've always known." He held her tighter. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you have." Part 3, Island of Grace. Finding the island officially took her 4 months. Finding it in herself took no time at all. She cross-referenced the coastline shape against every database she had professional access to, and several she didn't. She ordered maritime surveys going back to the 19th century. She spent her evenings bent over her light table with a magnifying glass, and her mornings staring at the photographs she'd taken of her own back, reversed, scaled, overlaid on charts with the translucent discipline of someone trained to read the language of landscape. She called in favors from colleagues who specialized in coastal cartography, framing her questions carefully, never showing anyone the photograph. In November, In an 1887 Nouvelle Scotian maritime survey, buried in a university archive, she'd been given remote access to, she found a small annotation in the margins of a regional chart. Ile de Grace. The notation was brief, barely a kilometer across. No permanent structures listed, no economic significance noted, no subsequent updates. A place that existed officially only in that one marginal note, then fell entirely through the cracks of modern record-keeping. Too small, too remote, too stubbornly, quietly itself. She looked at the shape of its coastline. She sat back in her chair. It was like looking in a mirror. The coastline she had been drawing in her notebook for 4 months. The coastline that lived on her own back in silver and red, curved and jutted and indented in every precise particular way that the island's outline did. Every cove matched, every point matched. The harbor, with its bent thumb shape, its shelter from the eastern wind, it was there, exactly as she had drawn it, exactly as she had dreamed it. She booked the ferry for the following week. She told Daniel she'd be back in 2 weeks, and that she loved him. She packed light. She took her notebook. She did not sleep on the ferry crossing. She stood at the bow in the cold Atlantic morning, watching the water the color of pewter heave and settle around the hull. And she felt something in her chest that she recognized, distantly, as homecoming, though she had never been to Nova Scotia and could not have explained the recognition to anyone without sounding unhinged. The cold was familiar. The smell of the water, the particular brine and kelp and mineral sharpness of the North Atlantic, moved through her like a key turning in a lock she'd forgotten she had. By the time the island came into view on the horizon, a low, dark shape rising from the gray water, she was gripping the railing with both hands. Her back was burning. The island in November was everything the dreams had given her, and several things they hadn't. The rocky shoreline was exactly right. The same worn granite she'd drawn 40 times over in her notebook, the same pale lichen spreading across the exposed faces of boulders, the same tidal pools dark with rockweed and bladderwrack. The smell of wood smoke from the settlement's chimneys threaded through the cold air and mixed with the salt and the seaweed and the distant, flinty scent of coming snow. There were 11 people living on Ile de Grace. Maren learned this from the ferryman, who came twice a week in reasonable weather and stopped altogether in the worst of winter. 11 people who had chosen, or been born into, a life on a kilometer of granite in the North Atlantic, who grew what they could in rocky soil behind windbreaks of spruce, who fished the surrounding waters with a practical intimacy, who maintained their houses with the particular diligence of people who understand that neglect in this climate is a form of death. The old woman was at the dock when the ferry touched the wooden pilings. She was small and straight-backed, dressed in a dark coat with the collar turned up against the wind, white hair pulled back beneath a wool hat.
"I know,"
answered the kid. Her face was seamed with the specific texture of a life lived largely outdoors, not aged so much as weathered, the way good weathers into something harder and more honest than what it started as. She had dark eyes that were absolutely still and absolutely awake, and she looked at Maren the moment she stepped off the gangplank with an expression that was not surprise, not welcome exactly, but something closer to recognition. The way you look at someone you knew, you would eventually see again. "You took your time," the old woman said. Her accent was the French of the maritime provinces, soft in different places than Parisian French, carrying the long memory of another century. Her English was precise and unhurried. Maren stopped in front of her. The wind off the water moved between them. "I didn't know I was supposed to come sooner," Maren said. The old woman considered this seriously, as though it were a legitimate explanation. "Non," she said at last. "I suppose you didn't." She extended her hand. "I am Cécile Marchand. My family has been on this island for 4 generations. She paused. 5. if you count the one before my grandmother. She looked at Maren in a way that made the words land carefully. Come inside, she said. The cold will be worse before it's better. Cecile's house was low and warm, its walls thick with the kind of insulation that comes not from engineering, but from decades of incremental weatherproofing. Layers of plaster and paint and wallpaper and more plaster, each generation's solution to the Atlantic winter. The kitchen was the warmest room, centered on a cast iron wood stove that radiated a heat so solid it felt almost like a physical presence, like a large, quiet animal. The table was set for two. Maren stopped in the doorway. You were expecting me? She said. I was expecting someone, Cecily said, setting a pot on the stove. I've been expecting someone for a long time. She glanced back. Sit, please. The soup is yesterday's, but it improves overnight. Maren sat. She put her bag on the floor beside her chair and looked around the kitchen. There were photographs on the wall, black and white, very old, the kind with the soft focus and formal posture of the 19th century. There were fishing tools hung near the door, and drying herbs from the low-ceiling beams, and a shelf of paperback novels in French beside the window that looked out to the harbor. And on the far wall, behind a small glass frame, there was a drawing. Maren's heart stopped. It was a map. She stood before she decided to stand. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and pressed her fingertips to the glass. The map behind it was drawn in fine, precise ink on paper that had gone the color of old cream. A hand-drawn chart of the island, every path mark, every cove labeled in cramped French script, the harbor rendered with particular care and love. It was detailed in the way that only knowledge earns. Not a surveyor's map, not a bird's-eye abstraction, but a lived map. A beloved map. The map of someone who had walked every line they drew. It was identical, in every particular, to the map on her back. Not similar, not reminiscent, identical. She became aware that Cecile was standing behind her. My grandmother drew this, Cecile said quietly. She was born on this island and she never left it, not once, in 78 years. She paused. She drew it because she was afraid. She was old, and she had no children who intended to stay. My grandfather had already gone to the mainland, my great-uncle to Quebec City. She was afraid that when she died, the island would be forgotten, that no one would remember its paths, its springs, its hollows, that the knowledge of it, her knowledge, a lifetime of it, would simply disappear. Cecile's voice was measured and even, but underneath, it was the reverence of someone recounting a sacred story. She drew 20 copies of this map and sent them to every member of the family still living, so they would know where they came from even if they never returned. Maren's hand was flat against the glass. She could feel her own pulse against it. And the original? She asked. She burned it, Cecile said. On the night she finished the copies, she built a fire on the eastern cliff and burned it there, over the water. A pause. She said that some things needed to return to where they came from, that the island should carry its own map. Maren turned slowly from the wall. What year? She asked. Her voice was barely a sound. Cecile told her. The year was 1971. Maren Solís had been born in November of 1971, on a Tuesday, in a small hospital in Western Virginia, 7 months premature and not expected to survive, a fact her mother had never entirely gotten over, a fact that had colored her mother's entire relationship with Maren with a particular fierce, terrified love, as though she'd been braced from the beginning for losing her. Maren stood in Cecile Marchald's kitchen on Ile-de-Grace and felt the room rearrange itself around her in a way that was not metaphorical. Something shifted in her understanding of her own life, not shattering, but settling, the way a house settles after a long winter, finding a truer alignment with the ground beneath it. She burned it on the night she finished. And I was born that November, premature, unexpected, not supposed to survive. she thought, but she did. She always survives. She just forgets, for a while, where she was. She pressed 2 fingers to the small of her back, through her coat, through her sweater, through everything. Pressed them to the place where the harbor lived in silver, on her skin. Cecile was watching her, with those still, awake eyes. Not surprised, not frightened. Waiting with the patience of someone who has always known that the story had an ending, and that the ending required a particular person to arrive. "You've been here before," Cecile said. It was not a question. "Yes," Maren said. "Though I was just remembering it now." Cecile nodded slowly. She turned back to the stove with the composure of a woman who had made room long ago for the kinds of truths that don't fit neatly inside ordinary life. "Sit down," she said again, gently. "The soup is ready, and I think you've been a long time getting here." She set 2 bowls on the table, unhurried. "You should eat before you try to remember anything else." Part 4. The Paths. She stayed for 2 weeks. Then she stayed for a third. Every morning she rose before full light and walked. She walked the paths that Cecile showed her, and the paths she found herself, stepping off the main track with a certainty she couldn't account for. Her feet choosing the way through the birch grove, skirting the boggy ground near the North Spring, finding the narrower track up to the eastern cliff without being told it was there. She walked them all without a map, because she didn't need one. The paths were already inside her, laid down in some substrate below memory, in the place where the body holds what the mind has not yet caught up to. Cecile walked with her some days, and on those days she talked. She told Maren about Adele, about her grandmother's hands, which had been calloused from rope work and stained with ink, about her voice, which had been low, dry, and humorous, and her habit of singing to herself when she thought no one was listening, old songs whose words even Cecile could not fully recall, about the way she had loved the island, not with sentiment, not with nostalgia, but with the practical, comprehensive love of someone who understood a place in its full complexity, its beauty and its difficulty, and its costs. "She had a scar on her right hand," Cecile said one afternoon, as they stood at the eastern cliff where Adele had burned the map, looking out at the gray Atlantic heaving below them. "From a fishing accident when she was young. She caught a hook badly." She glanced at Maren. "She was right-handed, but she taught herself to draw with her left so she could still work." Maren looked down at her own right hand, at the scar there, the one she'd had since childhood, the one she'd always told people was from a fall from a bicycle, which was what her mother had always said it was, because her mother had been the one to bandage it when she was 4 years old and could not explain where it had come from. Her left hand, she realized, had always realized, in some way, without examining it, was the one she drew with. She was right-handed in everything else, but she had always drawn with her left. Cecile watched her face process all of this. "She was afraid," Cecile said again, quietly, facing the ocean. "That's the thing I want you to understand. She loved this place so completely that the thought of its disappearance from human memory was genuinely unbearable to her. It was her great anguish." She paused. "And I have always thought that the love was too large to simply end, that it went somewhere." She looked at Maren with absolute calm, "that it came back." Maren stood at the edge of the cliff with the wind pulling at her coat and her silver mapped back to the sky, and felt, for the first time since the lightning, something that she could only call completion. Not closure, not the soft, finished feeling of a story resolved, but the completion of a circuit. The sense of energy that has traveled a long distance, finally arriving at the place it was always directed toward. She had been born early and unexpected, and barely surviving. She had been born a cartographer, with the hands for it, and the instinct for it, and the love of it that went beyond profession into something that felt, always, like vocation. She had been born with a scar she couldn't explain. She had been struck by lightning on a Tuesday, in a Virginia meadow, and the lightning had done what lightning does. It had revealed what was hidden. It had burned away everything, obscuring what was underneath. And underneath was this: a map of an island in the North Atlantic, drawn by a woman who loved it so fiercely that she had sent her love forward through time like a letter, sealed it inside a new life, and let it travel, trusting it would eventually find its way back. Maren put her face into the wind and let it scour her clean. I'm here, she thought, and did not know exactly who she was saying it to the island, to Adele, to herself across time. Perhaps it didn't matter. I came back. The island is remembered. Epilogue, the new map. On her last evening, she sat at Cecile's kitchen table with a fresh sheet of paper and drew the island from memory. She drew it with her left hand. She drew it the way she'd drawn it in her dreams, the way Adele had drawn it a century before. Not as a surveyor draws, not from data and instruments, but from love and long walking. She drew every path she'd walked, every cove she'd stood in, every spring, every cemetery stone she'd traced with her fingers in the north field, every spot in the birch grove where the light came through differently in the afternoon. She drew the harbor. She drew the eastern cliff. She drew, in the lower right corner, the small house with the wood stove and the photographs on the wall and the map in its glass frame. When she was finished, she looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Cecile, who had been sitting across from her the whole time, saying nothing, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea long gone cold. I want you to keep this one, Maren said. Cecile looked at the drawing. She reached across and touched its edge with one finger. When she looked up, her still, dark eyes were wet. And what will you take? She asked. Maren pressed her hand flat against her own back. I already have mine, she said. She crossed on the morning ferry. She stood at the stern this time, watching the island recede, watching its low, dark outline shrink against the gray sky, watching it become a shape and a shadow, then a suggestion on the horizon, and then nothing at all. But it was still there. It was mapped. It was remembered. It was written on her body in silver and fire, in the language of lightning and love and the refusal of a woman to be forgotten. The ferry moved on across the open water. Behind her, the island held its place in the sea, as it always had, exactly where it was supposed to be. And Maren Solís, who had died in a meadow on a Tuesday and been struck back into herself by something ancient and deliberate, turned her face toward home. Maybe sometime in the distant future. Perhaps in another future life she would be reborn and come back to this same familiar place.